How's everybody doing? It's good seeing you all, especially when I can be in the Zendo talking after last week. Hi, Roshi. Thank you all for such a wonderful Rahatsu last week. And Roshi, thank you for this space and your support and love. Really appreciate it. Well, so what I'm going to talk about tonight is eloquent silence. And winter is one of those times when I sort of feel like I hunker down a little bit and start to nest a little bit, and feel more inclined to be silent, to be quiet. And so I thought a lot about silence. Ooh, I need some water, please. Thank you. So hopefully what I talk about tonight, we all have experienced this eloquent silence. About 5 years ago, Roshi and Kodo and Kozan and Wendy and Kato, we were all in Nepal. And we were about 2 weeks into our journey. You know, there were like 28 Westerners. We had 74 Sherpas and over 100 horses and mules. And we were taking medical care into the Dolpo region of Nepal. And we're about 2 weeks into our 5-week journey. And we were in Danigar Meadows. Remember Danigar Meadows? And we had just finished a breakfast of porridge, pancakes, and eggs. It was 29 degrees out. And I only know this because Kodo keeps such good records. And so anyway, we had just finished Zazen, and this valley is kind of amazing. It's at 14,700 feet, and it's all high altitude sort of tundra and rock. And we're in this glacial bowl of a valley that ends in this beautiful blue-white just wall of ice from the end of the beginning of the glacier, the end of the glacier. And so we were just getting ready to depart on our 11-mile hike to Ringmo. And that's where Lake Baksundo is, which is this beautiful, like just jewel of a lake that's vibrant turquoise. And so we take off up this hill, this steep hill, which, you know, everyone from Nepal, they'd always laughingly call it Nepali flats. And it was anything but flat. So we're going up this hill, and you know, thank goodness for these big yak footprints that were in the hillside, because it sort of created stair steps that we could go up, and it certainly made the ascent much easier. Thank you. So a couple of hours into the hike, I get to this long arching trail, and I'm looking at this rocky field and these, just a massive mountain over here, and sort of behind me is another one. And then there's this little dip, and this is the pass that we've come to at 17,500 feet. So we've gone from 14,700 to 17,500, and there's nobody behind me, and there's nobody up to the pass where there's a rocky stupa and a bunch of prayer flags. And I imagine most everybody is still navigating this super steep hill. And, I look out over the trail, and I start really listening, really seeing if there's anything moving. I mean, everything was super still. And there, no rock falling down the hill. There was no wind. There was no, water over rocks. There were no voices. There was absolutely nothing. It was just this rocky field, not a sound at all. And I think it was one of the quietest moments of my life, sitting there among this vastness of the Himalayas. I once read that in ancient times, everything was silent. Everything was except thunder. And it was all just wind and quiet and loneliness. I mean, think about that. Can you imagine just wind and quiet and loneliness all the time? It's kind of amazing. So when I think about all of that, silence certainly has a significance. I mean, what would Brahms and Bach be without silence? Without the downbeats or the rests, The place where you can have exciting syncopated rhythms that develop. I always talk about John Cage. I was thinking, oh God, do I mention him like in the third talk in a row? But I love John Cage, and he's a 20th century composer. He was also a first wave Zen practitioner. And John Cage did not like applause between the movements of symphonies. And he also famously, in 1952, went into the London Symphony and went up on stage to debut his 4:33, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And, he waves his baton, and in 3 movements, the audience just sat in utter silence. 4 minutes, 33 seconds of silence. So silence plays out in various ways in our lives. When we're kids, we're always getting this, and we always hear like silence is golden. We have pregnant pauses, or I've heard some people say pregnant silences that occur, just before the words come out, or we're contemplating like what kind of stress we're going to be under once the words come out. We have moments of silence, right? I mean, if I called for a moment of silence, I bet 95% of you would know what to do, right? And do you know where moments of silence come from? Well, a few weeks ago, I watched All Quiet on the Western Front. And it's a beautifully filmed movie, extremely intense, but beautifully filmed movie. And it's about the Western Front in World War I. And World War I ended on November 11th at 11 in the morning. And so the King of England at the time, George V, he made a proclamation that they were going to have 2 minutes of silence at the 11th hour. And this was a practice that started in South Africa. And ever since then, we've had moments of silence. Here in the Zendo, we have intense moments of silence. Think about last week. We all sat in amazing silence. And, I remember being stunned many times when we'd be sitting in the Zendo for a Rahatsu, and there'd be 70 people in the Zendo, and you could hear a pin drop. And then COVID happened, and I think it even got quieter in here. Like, think of how quiet it was last week. It was amazing. Also during Rahatsu, we keep noble silence. And sure, you know how good I am at keeping noble silence. Well, noble silence is the silence that we keep, where we keep our eyes down. We don't say anything unless it's for utilitarian purposes. And, we keep this noble silence during sesshin and during some of our practice periods. And noble silence is, it's really important. It's an important aspect of how we operate around here. And Thich Nhat Hanh says that this noble silence is conscious, intentional quiet, where we refrain from speaking to keep quiet. And then we also refrain from speaking so that we don't cause any sort of harm in other people, when they're trying to practice. And does anybody, I assumed that noble silence came from Christian roots. You think about all of the monasteries that practice noble silence, the Carthusians and the Benedictines, and but I was mistaken. Does anybody know where noble silence comes from? No. The Buddha. Yeah. In the Pali Canon, the Ananda Sutta, there's a story about the wanderer, and the wanderer walks up to the Buddha and says, is the self real? And the Buddha doesn't answer the question. So the wanderer thinks a little bit, reframes the question, and asks it again. And the Buddha doesn't answer the question. And the wanderer, frustrated, wanders off, right? And so Ananda comes up, Ananda, Buddha's cousin, comes up to him and says, well, why didn't you answer the question? He said, well, if I'd answered the question, it would have either been my answer would have been misunderstood or misleading. And so the Buddhist silence from then on becomes known as noble silence. Now, throughout history, people have taken vows of silence. I think of the Trappists right off the bat, simply because, Cato and I used to go to this monastery out in Iowa. Thomas Merton's monastery was the Gethsemane, and he was a Trappist, and this was New Mallory. And we would go out, the Trappists for centuries took vows of silence. And until 1968, when Vatican II said, oh, you don't have to take a vow of silence anymore. So I became close friends with this brother Placid, who died last year at 92. But I said to Brother Placid one time, I'm like, Brother Placid, what was it like when you could start talking again? He's like, oh, it cleared up so much miscommunication. So, and in Buddhism, and in our roots, there are monks and nuns throughout history who have taken vows of silence. And they carry the shakujo, that staff that has little metal rings on the top of it. There's a little statue in the Genkan that has a shakujo in it. And I think, Kodo, you have one in your office in the corner. And they carry this staff because they're not talking at all. And it's to ward off animals, and also to let other people know that they're coming so that they can receive alms. So can you imagine living year in and year out a vow of silence? I can't. Our origins in Zen that arise on Vulture Peak also evolve out of silence. When the Buddha gathers all of his disciples and, he raises a fresh lotus flower to begin his discourse, and everyone is silent, the crowd is silent, and even Mahakashapa, who registers this silent smile of understanding and is enlightened. So silence, you can see, is significant. And I'm reminded of Herman Melville, who's this crazy guy who's out on the seas and hanging out with these enormous whales. And, he has this profound saying that all profound things and emotions of things are preceded by and attended by silence. So I'm like, wow, it's kind of amazing. So silence, we see, is quite powerful. And I think it can also be scary. We dip into silence and we're not sure what happens with silence or in silence, or what it does with us, and even some of the things it may trigger within us or foster within us. A lot can get stirred up and activated in silence. So think for a minute, how does silence settle over your life? How do you experience silence both inside yourself and outside yourself? And importantly, do you make space for silence? And we're in this world that's so, full of noise, really. Our phones, our TVs, our music, it could go on and on and on. And do you make space for silence? When I think of silence, I really think about my granddad, who was certainly a man of few words. Roshi and Natalie and others will talk about Robaishin, grandmother's heart, which is someone who operates out of what Dogen calls great compassion. They have stability, predictability. They're not scary dragons, as Roshi says. And my granddad certainly had grandmother's heart. And one of the things that he would always tell me when I was young, anytime I felt fear or I lacked confidence in something, he would say, he's like, Jimbo, you got this. You got this. And one time we went down to the creek in his hometown in North Carolina, in the mountains of North Carolina. And we went down there because my granddad loved skipping stones. You ever skipped stones on a creek? Where you find those flat stones And, with precision and gentleness, you throw it across the water and it does its little bounce. Well, my granddad was a master at skipping stones and he loved to go down there. And, I was a little kid at the time, so I'm sure I was just rambling on because I like to talk. And so while we're skipping stones, he's having to endure my droning on, or asking silly questions. And at one point, he's like, Jimbo, he's like, listen. And I look over to him and, he's sort of looking out across the creek and he's got his ear. He had big ears, his big ear up in the air. And he's like, do you hear that? Like, hear what? I don't hear anything. He's like, listen. Like listening. He's like, did you hear that? I'm like, no. He's like, so a little more time passes and all of a sudden this bird swooshes out and up into a tree and there's this explosion of bird chirps. And, I look over at my granddad and he's smiling and I'm like, oh, baby birds. You hear this? So it really makes me think, in the silence, do you ever have those moments when the veil is lifted and the magic begins? That was one of those moments. I have the habit of waking up in the morning, early in the morning, and, you go out on the porch. I'm just down the street from here. Go out on the porch and I'm walking to get the paper. And as the night sort of is moving into the day, you think you're in utter silence. And I'm like looking up at, Orion's Belt and Rigel and Betelgeuse and the Horsehead Nebula. And all of a sudden you hear a little finch chirp, or you hear, a blackbird squawk, or the neighbor's trash can a few blocks away is rolling to the curb. And you hear the low hum of the city, which almost disappeared during COVID. So in the silence of the morning, you start to hear the sounds of silence. And the same thing happens in the Zendo. Think about when you're sitting there and you're in utter silence and all of a sudden you hear the breath of the person next to you, or you may even hear the breath of the person across the Zendo. You hear that door, and that door has that distinct sound and just opens. You might hear, well, we always hear the birds, but have you ever heard the donkey? That donkey, what a surprise it was the first time I ever heard that. And you may even hear your own heartbeat. I read an article recently about a person who entered an anechoic chamber. Do you know what those are? This was a chamber that was at Harvard. And an anechoic chamber is a space that sucks out all the silence. Like it absorbs all the all the sounds. And the outside of it, all the walls, the ceilings, the floors, they're all soundproofed. And so this person goes into the anechoic chamber expecting utter silence. But instead, here's two things, a low sound, like a low pitch, and a high pitch. And so, gets out of the chamber and is like, what are these two sounds I heard? And the engineer said, well, the high sound is your nervous system in operation, and the low sound is your blood circulating. So where total silence was expected, sound emanated. And this may be what is behind the silence in 433, the sound of silence. Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami says, silence, I discovered, actually makes a noise. So if we are aware and we attend, in all of that silence, we really start to hear, maybe our heartbeat, maybe the blood coursing through our body, maybe the hum of a city, or the interior silence of our mind, which always seems to be giving way to those words, those sounds of our mind just churning away all those thoughts. So silence gives way to paying attention. And how do we attend? How do we pay attention to the unfolding of silence in our day-to-day activities? And when we do, what can happen? Think about that. In the silence, in the moment of our silencing, there's sort of an undergirding, a kind of truth that can come through, especially if we're paying attention. I think of Prince Siddhartha, the Buddha. Think about when the Buddha first uncovered all of the pain and suffering of the world. He ventures out of the palace on a chariot and sees, a dead body for the first time, sees someone sick with disease for the first time, sees an old person. His father had been keeping all of this from him, sort of showering him with privilege and luxury so that, with the thoughts that he would be the king. Well, once Buddha saw all of the suffering, he wondered how people can find happiness, in such a harsh world. And that's when he set out to find the answer, the truth of birth and death, and find peace. And as you know, he experimented in so many ways. He hung out with the gurus and the yogis and the ascetics, those who would sort of really starve themselves and tortured their bodies just to sort of obviate any sort of physical needs that they may have. And after he was with the ascetics for 6 years, as you know, no longer close to his peace of mind, no longer close to his enlightenment, he left them and he ventured down to the river where he would go every day for a drink of water. And while he was there at the riverbank, he saw a boat go by with musicians, and there was one of the musicians was teaching his students how to play instruments. And this is where we heard, the string shouldn't be too tight or it will snap, this would be the ascetics. And any string too loose won't play. This is a life of indulgence. And so hearing this, he sort of doesn't slumber off, but he goes to his kind of quiet place, and again, he's tired, he's been sick, he's emaciated, and he starts thinking about when he was a young child, maybe 6 or 7. And he's watching farmers toil. They're sweating and they're working super hard. They're like driving their oxen through the fields and, churning up what's in the soil, and what's in the soil can't make it. He's seeing a lot of difficulties and suffering. And at the same time, he sees the blue sky and he sees the birds effortlessly flying in the air, and he smells the sweet apple blossoms that he's underneath this tree as a child, and he smells that. And then back beside the river after his revelry, he realizes that within his childhood memory, there was room in the world for both suffering and beauty. No string too tight, no string too loose. And he felt peace. And he realized in his silence, in his reflection, that things came to him. Things came to him. And this is when he realized the middle path, between self-denial and overindulgence. And we know later that in the silence underneath the Bodhi tree, that's where he realized his enlightenment. So what are the kinds of things that can come to us in silence? Silence that may be a moment within the chaos of our lives. What is the silence saying? John Cage was able to unearth entire symphonies in the quiet and the silence of packed concert halls. In the silences that sort of happen upon me in moments when I feel stress or fear or lack of confidence. I hear those words, Jimbo, you've got this. And, these words said so long ago in a moment of grandfatherly love. And a little over a month ago, decades after I first heard those words, I heard those words again in a moment of silence, in a moment of quiet, when I had a momentous decision to make. And I know some of you I have a pilot's license, and I flew down to Marfa, Texas with Cato and some friends. And the day that we were supposed to leave, it was super stormy out. I mean, the clouds were super low. It was windy and raining, and there's no way we could have left that day. And then the next day, things had improved. It was still overcast. In fact, in Santa Fe, you couldn't even take off in a small plane. But it was overcast down there. There was no wind, there was no rain, but it really wasn't at a place where we could take off. And so here we are. We've spent one day we didn't want to be there, and now we're spending another day that we don't want to be there. And I'm feeling a lot of pressure because, one of the people in the group is doing therapy over the telephone. Another person is the director of a large organization and was doing Zoom meetings on their computer, and they didn't want to be there. I mean, nobody wanted to stay in Marfa. So around the time of day when it was at like that time when I either had to make a decision or not, I'm like, do we take off? Do we not take off? I decided I'm going to go up to the highest place in Marfa. And it was the courthouse, built in 1893. And you go up into the cupola, and there is no one in this courthouse. It's open, you walk in, you go all the way up to the cupola, and there are these windows all the way around. And I got up there, and the cloud ceiling was at 2,500 feet, which is really low for a small plane. And then the area where we wanted to go, the clouds went all the way down to the ground. But there was this little opening off to the side where you could see light and you could see the mountains. And in that time, in that silence, I started really listening with my eyes, with my ears, with my body. And it occurred to me, you can always turn around. So we wound up taking off, and we headed toward that light, and we sort of hugged the canyon, and we looked for openings. And ultimately, we flew, sort of anchored with the knowledge that we could always turn around. So sometimes when we don't know how to navigate, we take a moment of quiet, and we may find how to navigate. We may find, how do we get through this? How can I get through this? And in that silence, we find a window in the sky. And isn't this what we do? Sort of quietly, clearly, simply, finding a window in the sky, finding a window in the silence. Causes and conditions at this moment shine completely in the silence. These words from Dongshan from the 9th century are still so relevant today and will always be relevant. Causes and conditions at this moment shine completely in the silence. We all have times, we all have stories, we all have markers in our lives, in our own quiet, in our own silence, in the pauses where eloquence just seeps through, bleeds through, is realized, and we find our way. And can you think about when this has occurred in your own life? Our solutions, our peace of mind really lie within. And there's no special formula. There's no invitation for this to occur. We really do it all the time. And these silences just sort of seep through like 10,000 dharma gates. And we all have this ability to be still, to be silent, and to know. Recognize that you have this and do this. It's awareness. Stephen Batchelor, the famous Buddhist scholar, tells us to ask, what is this? Without any interest in the answer. And then to open ourselves completely to what will come, to what you hear, he says, in the silences that follow. In the silences that follow. So pay total attention to the very midst of what it means to be human in this moment. Anxious moments, confusion, anger, what you experience right here, right now. Just this, Roshi says, just this. And this is what arises within and what's going all around you in every moment. Sitting here in the Zendo, outside of this Zendo, in all of the wonder that goes on in your day-to-day in the world. And if we pay total attention, you'll hear that wind moving through the air, that hum of the city, the voices that are supporting you in your own mind and your experience here and now. We all have this source for attending, for paying attention, for listening to the silence, for being vividly awake. Roshi tells us that our practice is really about being awake, about waking up, and waking up to this very moment as it is, not bypassing, but paying total attention to our life as it is, right here, right now, each of us, just as we are. What is this? Just listen. In our silence, the eloquence of so many things can arise. So many things can be presented, understood, elucidated, and maybe even recognized for the first time. And I know sometimes the listening can be so difficult, but it's where we have the ability to be open in our mind and heart, that source of all compassion and love. And isn't that what's so lovely about our practice? This awareness. So, like the Buddha on the banks of the river so long ago, we stop, we pause, we take a moment, maybe a long moment. And in the silence, in the quiet, is embedded this listening, a kind of larger non-text to the silence, which is being with our senses, our eye, our ear, our nose, our tongue, our body, our mind, and then transcending these things. No eyes, no ears, no tongue, no body, no mind, to wisdom beyond wisdom. Wisdom beyond wisdom. Those words of the Heart Sutra that we chant almost every day. So fully awake, fully aware from this moment of silence, this wisdom beyond wisdom that we return to again and again, moment by moment, we can do exactly what the Buddha did. See how we might liberate the suffering of others and how we might liberate our own suffering. And this is the point of all our journeys, I think. Of all our 10,000 eloquent silences, we can engage the world and make it a better place. This is our practice. So back to Marfa. I was on a side street, an empty side street, and there was a stop sign. And underneath it, someone had artfully written, talking. So I will stop talking and invite us to just listen to the silence. Just listen. Thank you all for this shared practice.